And do you mind, look, if you don't have a handout, raise your hand for me real quick. 1, 2, 3. Looks like we got 3 different ones. So raise your hand so Richard is able to deliver those to you. Awesome. And we'll be working through that, of course, as we go throughout the day. I know it's been a couple weeks regarding that second session and the notes and the homework that were given to you then. Did anybody have the opportunity to kind of go through that, at least read through the text a little bit in preparation for today? Was that useful to you at all, some of those things? I'll tell you right now, you're going to luck out with the level of homework this week, because I was just too beat and energy was taken all sorts of from me. So you only have one homework question this week, and you might luck out again next week, because I'll be headed out to church camp. But after that, you better be ready. I might give you 2 pages. Just be prepared for that. I'm just kidding. Probably won't have 2 pages because one sheet is very concise. Last class, we didn't really get to chapter 3. Didn't really even get to chapter 2. But chapter 3 is pretty important in getting to these next chapters today, which will be chapters 4 through 7. Go ahead and be turning to Job chapter 4. We're going to start there, kind of start there today. But it's important to kind of revisit what was going on there in chapter 3. For those who happen to have the time to read it, can you give me kind of a synopsis of what happened in chapter 3? Maybe one sentence describing what was going on? Was Job displeased with his situation? Absolutely. Kind of what was going on there. He was just he was in desperation, crying out all of these different things. Verse 11 sums it up, I think, in a pretty intense way. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb, and expire? I mean, he was devastated. And why would he be devastated? What happened to him in chapters 1 and 2? He lost everything. He lost his wealth. He lost his servants. He lost his children. And even in chapter 2, his wife didn't really even seem to offer him good theological support. It was a devastating situation for him. And he cries out in chapter 3. I do find it pretty interesting that Job doesn't so much wish for his death. He wishes that he hadn't been born. I'm sure there is some pretty interesting thought process we can travel down that way. Suffice it to say, he was very miserable. Chapter 4 begins with one of Job's friends speaking, this man being Eliphaz the Temanite. We don't know a lot about this guy. We know his name is Eliphaz. We know he's a Temanite. And we'll come to find that he's got some pretty bad theology. And that's about it. You will find the name Eliphaz in a couple of other places in the Old Testament, but those are almost certainly not this man. There are some who might suggest, if they think there's kind of a later time frame for the events of Job, who might suggest there's a relationship between this Eliphaz and any of the other ones which are mentioned. Probably not. Namely because those other Eliphazes are listed in the tribes of Israel. And this is almost certainly not who this man was, being a Temanite. Nevertheless, he is a friend of Job, and we know he's a friend of Job because his desire to help his friend is quite evident in chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. They're at the end of the chapter. But it kind of tries to help in a way he's not quite qualified for. Let's see what that looks like here in the first 6 verses of Job chapter 4. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, "If one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope?" verse 2, where he begins speaking, doesn't give us a whole lot of confidence in how Eliphaz is about to handle him. Notice, if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? In other words, Job, I hear you, kind of referring to what was going on in chapter 3. Job, I hear you, but I kind of got to say something about how you're reacting right now. So that's what he's getting at in verse 2. Something fascinating, though, in verses 3 and 4. Are those harsh words or are those kind words that he's speaking with there? Verses 3 and 4. They're complimentary. You have admonished many. You have strengthened weak hands, Job. It seems as though, and I think this is kind of getting into your question 1 there on the handout, what does Eliphaz in these 2 verses reveal about Job's character? Shouldn't so much say reveal, but rather expound on, right? Because we know he's a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. But such a man, we shouldn't be surprised. He's somebody who helps others, has helped others. I think there's pretty good reason to believe that Eliphaz has probably been a recipient of this help. If nothing else, he has observed it or heard about it at some point. No surprise here, Job is a good man who has helped others work through their own forms of suffering. But go ahead.
He's kind of a backhand compliment.
Right.
Take your own advice.
Right, and
he's appealed to God and accepted.
Exactly, that's where he kind of viciously turns to the right here. Just like Jack pointed out, it's kind of setting him up to kind of be a hypocrite. Eliphaz is calling Job a hypocrite here. And I think we can acknowledge that's pretty unreasonable. As we go through the text, we'll see that clearly that is the case. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Excuse me. Is not your fear of God, your confidence in the integrity of your ways, your hope? He is calling Job's integrity into question. Why? Because Job is in desperate state of suffering. He's in a desperate state of suffering and dared to be vulnerable. There's something we can learn about how we can interact with our friends, namely our friends who are enduring these sufferings from Eliphaz, kind of what not to do in this case. He goes on, even questioning his faithfulness, and reveals something about how he understands God to operate starting in verse 7. Let's read verses 7 through 11 now. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they come to an end. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the whelps of the lioness are scattered. This lion pride analogy that's happening here is essentially is likening the bad person to the lion. And God's roar, his breath, his blast of air, all those can be decent translations for the Hebrew there, will break down the bad person. What is the logical conclusion first that Eliphaz is drawing Job out to be? Remember now, whoever perished being innocent. What is he trying to suggest about Job?
This wouldn't have happened had you not done something.
Exactly. Job, obviously you're a bad guy. You're doing something very wrong because there's some pretty bad stuff that just happened to you, man. What do we know about Job? Blameless, upright, feared God, and turned away from evil. How do we know that about Job? God said. It's one of my favorite church camp phrases from growing up. God said. That's right. So we know that he's blameless, upright, and fears God, turns away from evil. But you know what? We're kind of in question 2 here, by the way. Looking there at prompt B under question 2. Who from the New Testament is the chief example who stands against Eliphaz? Who was a blameless and upright man who was sinless and yet perished? Jesus Christ. Eliphaz doesn't have very good theology at all. Whoever perished being innocent, lots of people. Millions of people, probably billions throughout the history of the earth. So here's an important follow-up question to this. Something that we as Christians need to be prepared to accept and then help others navigate and navigate ourselves if the time comes. Look there in prompt C. What does that naturally imply about good things or bad things happening to good people or bad people? Can good things happen to good people? Obviously. I mean, we saw what Job was like before. He had a hedge put up around him by God. That's saying something. Do bad things happen to good people? Obviously. Do good things happen to bad people? I mean, you look at the book of Habakkuk sometime. And Habakkuk's like, how long do I have to sit here and look at how these bad people, or how bad your people are, God, before you do something about it? And God's like, do you really want to know? You don't really want to know. I'll tell you. And he told him, and it's like, well, are you sure God has to be that bad? Good things happen to bad people. Ultimately, justice happens and bad thing happens to bad people too, kind of making these general statements. But it is hugely important for us to realize this, as that allows us to navigate life knowing that God is ultimately going to take care of us. And we will see that particularly once we get to chapter 6, if we make it there. I think we will. Excuse me. Let's move on now to another interesting section here. Before my bad. Look there in verse 8. Somebody read verse 8. Someone who's got a real loud, powerful voice. Read verse 8 for us. I know there are a few of you in here. Come on.
Even as I have seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same.
Even as I have seen. Joe, whose authority is Eliphaz appealing to for his theology?
His own experience.
His own experience. That theology, of course, being who has done good and why, and bad. Words are hard. Give me a second. Why would bad things happen to good people is essentially what he's getting at. Bad things don't happen to good people. That's what Eliphaz is saying. We've already established that's wrong. I think Billy Joel probably would have had a problem with that theology too. I don't know that he's really someone to base it off of. What does that suggest about how we form our theology? Is it good? Is it okay? This is kind of question 3 here. Is it acceptable to base your theology on experience? Seeing a lot of head shakes that say no. Why is that? Your theology may not agree with God's. Yes, Jennifer.
In Matthew 5:45, Christ even says that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and the unjust. So good and bad is going to happen.
Good and bad is going to happen. We know that's the case through passages like that, through bad things happening to even our Lord, which clearly goes against those things that even Eliphaz at least says he experiences. We cannot base our spirituality merely on experience. I'm not suggesting that there isn't some degree that experience can be useful. You know, we've just had some wonderful news this past week. It was very exciting for me to find out, even overseas, that we've added 2 new members to the church who happen to be at this congregation. Praise God. That's an experience. And frankly, I just about guarantee, think about the experience you felt when you came up out of the water. That's an experience, and I think you can use that effectively towards the ministry of the kingdom. But we don't all have that same sort of experience. We certainly can't base our spirituality on that. It is a dangerous thing to do, and we need to constantly be on guard against it, or else we'll go against the theology of God, which is the only one that matters. Right? All right. Now let's move forward. Verse 12, we'll read through the end of the chapter. Eliphaz speaking here. Now a word was brought to me stealthily, and my ear received a whisper of it. Amid disquieting thoughts from the visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me and trembling, and made all my bones shake. Then a spirit passed by my face. The hair of my flesh bristled up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes. There was a silence, and then I heard a voice. We'll get to what the voice says here in a second. I said we go to the end of the chapter. I lied. Sorry. Now a word was brought to me stealthily. A spirit passed by my face. This is a pretty bizarre encounter that Eliphaz is speaking about here. And there are a couple of different schools of thought on it. Some do think that it was either God in some way or one of his angels coming down to deliver this word. Based on what he begins talking about, what Eliphaz reports this voice saying in verses 17 through 21, we'll get to in a sec, I personally find that very hard to believe because there's some pretty bad stuff that's brought up there. And God and his faithful angels don't tend to talk about bad things, right? Which is why many others think he could be lying, just in general. He's trying to strengthen his case with Job, his clearly bad theology, by saying that he's got some authority other than himself to appeal to. That's possible. However, there are others, and I'll tell you right now, I am among this group of people who think there probably was some spiritual being that came and spoke to him, but it was not someone who, had any good motivations for talking. Recall, Satan was given the authority to touch everybody but Job, and really touch everybody, including Job, just couldn't kill him. I don't see that there's any reason why Satan or one of his angels couldn't be the one who delivered this, especially that whole dread and shaking and the bones shaking, all that. Can't help but wonder, especially because there's some really bad stuff that continues to be communicated here in verses 17 through 21. We don't know for sure, whatever it was. I kind of take Eliphaz a little bit at his word here. Just because he's wrong doesn't mean that he's dishonest. I think it was a spiritual entity, a little more demonic in nature. Let's look at what he said. Can mankind be just before God? This is verse 17. Can a man be pure before his maker? He puts no trust, excuse me. He puts no trust even in his servants, and against his angels he charges error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed before the moth. Between morning and evening they are broken in pieces. Unobserved, they perish forever. Is not their tent cord plucked up within them? They die, yet without wisdom. Wherever he got this information from, whether he made it up or there was some deliverer of this information, let's kind of look at that and see, I think as evidence that it clearly is not from God. Question number 1. Can mankind be just before God? Yes or no? Absolutely. How do we know that? Well, there's one really good example right here. So there's one. We know that Job was blameless, upright, feared God, and turned away from evil. Who else? Noah. Who else? You ever read 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 10? How about every Christian who walks in the light as he is in the light? How about every Christian who walks in a manner worthy of our Lord, from Colossians chapter 1? Can mankind be just before God? The answer is yes. Absolutely. Unquestionably. This question being asked here in chapter 4, verse 17, clearly is trying to imply no, mankind can't be just before God. Yes, ma'am.
This version I'm using today, I use every week,
Okay.
is modern English version, and the question there is read as, can a Lord be more righteous than God? More righteous.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
I'm wondering if there's other versions that say more. Because if the question is more righteous, then of course we're answering it differently.
Regarding, does their own excellence go away? Let's see. Anybody have the New King James? There it is. Can mortal man be more righteous than God? Even better. Oh, that's great. I love that. I maybe should have done a little bit more Hebrew homework there myself.
It's a fuss, a translation fuss.
Okay.
Does it say twice, I think? Can a man be twice as right
Okay.
or pure before God? But it's a translation argument.
Okay.
Which if you look at that, you'll see their argument. So it could go either way.
Well, that's fair. That does, and that certainly would change the answer to the question, because no, a mortal cannot be more righteous than God. So that's interesting. Nevertheless, let me see. He puts no trust in his servants. We can talk to that point. Does he put trust in his servants then? Let's go based on that. My version says he puts no trust even in his servants. New King James suggests he puts no trust in his servants. Is that true? Not true at all. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2. In fact, let me actually pull that one up. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2. I should have that one memorized because it's the theme verse of Bear Valley. So anybody from Bear Valley who's watching this right now, if you happen to be, don't take away my diploma, please. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, the things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust, that is a command, entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. The things which you have heard from me, he is referring to basically pretty much every bit of doctrine that we have in the New Testament. Does God trust his servants? Absolutely, he does. Whether they be man or angels. If he charges his angels with error, he can charge angels with error, but can angels be without error? Yeah, absolutely, because they can be obedient to God. So no doubt there is a solid question here, but I think the answer is certainly we can be just before God. That's kind of why I think this is probably not coming from God. Though the language of the New King James, I can see how it makes a little bit of confusion there. Chapter 5, Eliphaz continues his conversation with Job. We'll read through a fair bit of it. The prompt there, number 4 on your page, we're kind of bounce around all of those different ones that are associated with chapter 5. So Sorry, you're just going to have to keep up. And there's nothing simple about that. So bear with me on it. Let's read the first 7 verses there. Call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? Into which of the holy ones will you turn? For anger slays the foolish man, and jealousy kills the simple. I have seen the foolish taking root, and I cursed his abode immediately. His sons are far from safety, they are even oppressed in the gate, and there is no deliverer. His harvest the hungry devour, and take it to a place of thorns, and the schemer is eager for their wealth. For affliction does not come from the dust, nor does trouble sprout from the ground, for man is born for trouble, as sparks fly upward. All right. There, in this first passage, really in the whole of chapter 5, is there some truth to what Eliphaz is saying here? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, chapter 5, verse 2, for anger slays the foolish man and jealousy kills the simple. I mean, that's a straight up proverb. Absolutely, there's wisdom there. The foolish taking root and it curses abode immediately. His sons are far from safety. Still talking about the foolish one. His harvest the hungry devour. Here's the question, though. Contextually, what is Eliphaz trying to say to Job, or rather about Job? He's been bad. Exactly. He's essentially calling Job the foolish man here. He's calling him the angry man here. What? We'll see later on in chapter 6 Job's real thoughts towards these things. There is truth to what Eliphaz is saying, absolutely, but just because we use the truth doesn't mean we necessarily use it properly, right? Let's go on. Starting in verse 8. But as for me, I would seek God, and I would place my cause before God, who does great and unsearchable things, wonders without number. He gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields, so that he sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the plotting of the shrewd so that their hands cannot attain success. He captures the wise by their own shrewdness, and the advice of the cunning is quickly thwarted. By day they meet with darkness and grope at noon as in the night. But he saves from the sword of their mouth, and the poor from the hand of the mighty. So the helpless has hope, and unrighteousness must shut its mouth. I mean, where's the lie there? Is God capable of doing great and unsearchable things? Verse 9. Y'all. We'll see later on in chapters 38 through 41 just how great some of those things can be. Unsearchable things. I'm reminded of Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. Secret things belong to God. There are things that God knows and we just don't, and that's all there is to it. We're never going to know those things. He's right about that. He gives rain on the earth and sends water to the fields. Think about Matthew chapter 6, starting there in verse 28. It's in that passage where he's talking about anxieties. You know, why are you worried about things? Doesn't he even take care of the lilies of the field and the grass? How much more value do we have than those things? He sets on high those who are lowly. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they that's for they will inherit the earth. I think that's that one. There's some real honest truth that he's speaking about God here, which suggests that Eliphaz, while he has wrong theology in some aspects of his understanding of God and how he operates, he's not completely wrong. Hopefully he understands the full correction that he receives at the end of the book. Spoiler alert.
Misusing the truth. That's, I'm going to go to the back of the book. That's what God is going to ultimately say. So he condemns his
I know that I have.
That's what
I know you weren't asking me, but I know that I have.
that is the question, and yeah, if you do, you could be in jeopardy. Go to the end of the book and you'll find out, God isn't very pleased, even though he says the truth, he's misusing the truth. His theology, he believes he's a lot more wise than Job is, theologically.
Right.
And he spouts some truth, but he doesn't know what's going on. And you and I don't either, because we don't have the big picture.
Exactly. Exactly. We cannot suppose to know those things of God. Ironic that he mentions those great and unsearchable things. And to your point, Jack, he is clearly misusing this truth. There in verse 16, and unrighteousness must shut its mouth. Who is he talking about? He's talking about Job. Ironic, right? Good point. Good point. Ironically, he really should be talking to himself, understanding his, taking his own advice, as it were.
Right. To me, he sounds like a jealous person, and he knows that Job has got problems, and he wants to make everybody know that he's been wrong.
He certainly
And that's why he's in trouble.
He certainly could be jealous, especially back there in verse 2, for anger slays the foolish man and jealousy kills the simple. I mean, if he were to persist with this poor theology, which could stem from jealousy, that would end up ruining him spiritually, right? Doesn't necessarily outright say that. He certainly thinks he's got the wisdom to provide Job here. He thinks that he's in a position of righteousness, whatever that is. So that's a good point. But clearly he's misusing the truth. Let's finish out the chapter now, except for verse 27. Behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for he inflicts pain and gives relief. He wounds, and his hands also heal. From 6 troubles he will deliver you. Even in 7 evil will not touch you. In famine he will redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. You will be hidden from the scourge of the tongue, and you will not be afraid of violence when it comes. You will laugh at violence and famine, and you will not be afraid of wild beasts. For you will be in league with the stones of the field, and the beasts of the field will be at peace with you. You will know that your tent is secure, for you will not visit your abode and fear no loss. You will know also that your descendants will be many, and your offspring as the grass of the earth. You will come to the grave in full vigor, like the stacking of grain in its season. Again, more truth here, which is clearly being misused. God, excuse me. I don't have COVID, I promise. I got a negative result last Friday, otherwise they wouldn't have let me back in the country. God does inflict pain, and he gives relief. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 28 as absolute firm evidence of that. God is vindicated in all the things he does in the punishment of Israel through that chapter. So there is truth to that. But Eliphaz is not using that truth properly. In famine, he will redeem you from death. Very true. Genesis chapters 41 and 42, when Joseph and his family ultimately get delivered from famine. You better believe that God was behind that. He even talks about that in Malachi chapter 3. And in war, from the power of the sword. Think of Hezekiah and how he was able to resist Sennacherib because of his faithfulness. These are true things. There's some probably misspoken things there in verses 22 through 24, like the beasts of the field will be at peace with you. Well, Paul was a pretty righteous person, and he had to deal with wild beasts at Ephesus, so who knows if there's any truth to that? Probably not. But it comes really to a head here in verse 27. Behold this, we have investigated it, and so it is. Hear it, Job. He's speaking to Job here. And know for yourself. Not exactly sure who this we is. I imagine it's the 3 friends who are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We have investigated it. Curious to know how they've investigated it. Curious to know about that claim, because clearly they weren't consulting God. And imagine yourself in Job's shoes. Just put it that way. Hear it and know for yourself. These are your friends, the first of the three to speak, and this is what he has to say. Do you feel comforted? Probably not. A little speculative, I guess, but I think it's a pretty reasonable conclusion. So here's the question. What does this imply about how we ought to apply truth to the hurting? Or really, how we ought to apply truth in general. This is the last part of prompt number 4 there. For those true things that he did bring up, how did he apply those to Job? What was his motivation? You're a bad dude. This is the good stuff that happens to good people. You're a bad dude. And you need to know about these things. If you're hurting real bad, you probably already know that God's in control and that there are the great things of God. Is a lecture something you want to receive when you're in the midst of suffering? That's exactly what Eliphaz has done, and that's what the friends will continue to do for several more chapters in the book. And not only that, they're just simply wrong in how they're applying that information. Not only are they abusing the truth, they're just straight up wrong in the basis of a lot of those things. We need to be informed about proper, godly theology first, and then rightly know how to give that comfort to our people who are suffering. And it was something that we could do well to apply to ourselves when we are suffering. We can actually see a touch of that as we go through chapter 6. We won't quite make it all the way through, but let's look at how Job kind of responds to this. Oh, go ahead.
What he doesn't do, he talks about his expectation, but he doesn't give specifics. If you're going to come and correct me, you need to give me specifics. Don't give me generalities.
Great point.
Give me the specifics of my sin. He doesn't give any specifics on, on Friday last week he didn't do that. It's all generalities because of a bad theology that good people, bad things don't happen to good people, etc. Which we still have a little of that now. I've heard it sometimes. Not too long ago, somebody had a car wreck. I heard somebody say, I think he was having some other problems. Insinuation being that he's car wreck maybe because he had problems. I don't think God works that way. If he does, I don't know.
Right, and we can't know.
So just give specifics. If you're interested,
Oh, that's a really good point.
I'll just say that everybody don't come give me a bunch of generalities because I don't know what generalities are.
That's a real good point, and I think Job really gets into that later on in chapter 6.
He questions the investigation.
Exactly. We got about 4 more minutes. Let's drive through chapter 6 here, or at least as much of it as we can. Then Job answered, "Oh, that my grief were actually weighed and laid in the balances together with my calamity, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the seas. Therefore my words have been rash, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. Their poison my spirit drinks, and the terrors of God are arrayed against me. Does the wild donkey bray over his grass, or does the ox low over his fodder? Can something tasteless be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the white of any egg? My soul refuses to touch them. They are like loathsome food to me. Oh, that my request might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off." Pause right there. This is a whole lot more of Job's suffering coming out. Right? I mean, he is still in deep bitter pain. And it's the first time that it seems to imply that he kind of wishes God would just finish the job. But, verse 10, but it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What is my strength that I should wait? And what is my end that I should endure? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Is it that my help is not within me, and that deliverance is driven from me? He's asking these rhetorical questions to his friends. Where does my strength come from in all of this? Is it me? Is it you? What is the answer? What is my strength that I should wait? The words of the Holy One, verse 10, going right back to that. So Job knows that Eliphaz is off his rocker here. Starting in verse 14, it's very clear. For the despairing man, there should be kindness from his friend. Are you listening, Eliphaz? So that he does not forsake the fear of the Almighty. My brothers have acted deceitfully like a wadi. Andrea, I imagine you got to see some wadis, didn't you? So wadis, in case you didn't know, are essentially dry riverbeds. That's a not perfect explanation, but that's essentially it. And we can see where this deception is, like the torrents of wadis which vanish. They come and go with the seasons. You can't really rely on them very well for water. Like the torrents of wadis which vanish, which are turbid because of ice, and into which the snow melts. When they become waterless, they are silent. When it is hot, they vanish from their place. Their paths of their course wind along. They go up into nothing and perish. The caravans of Tema looked. The travelers of Sheba hoped for them. They were disappointed, for they had trusted. They came there and were confounded. Indeed, you have now become such. You see a terror and are afraid. Have I said, give me something, or offer a bribe for me from your wealth, or deliver me from the hand of the adversary, or redeem me from the hand of tyrants? And he goes on, essentially saying, I should be able to rely on you, friends, and I have found nothing here but a dried up riverbed. There should be a fountain here of encouragement and trust from you, and it's wasted. I saw a hand back there. Is it you, Jennifer?
And our friend, keeping warm him at the point that he's saying, God may as well take me.
Right.
Hanging on to then, but then that just pushed him over, pushed him. Sometimes we have to jettison the people that we've respected and they come to us and we have to run away for something that they just don't have the best interest for our future.
That is frighteningly true. And Job certainly lays into his friends there a little bit when he calls them these wadis. That would have been a tremendous insult to them. All righty, folks. We got one more statement, and we'll take that. Did you have a hand up too? Wadi? Yep. Can you read that? Okay, cool. Black on white, and my handwriting usually is not very legible, I know, so I'm glad you could. All right. Thank you, everybody. If I could get you to kind of send your clipboards up, but certainly keep your handouts. Next week, be ready to go over chapters 8 through 10. Read through those for me, if you would. Well, not for me. Read through them for yourself.